I'm a rational person, an accountant, actually, who deals in facts and figures. But what happened to me at the Clown Motel in Tonopah, Nevada, 3 years ago changed everything I thought I knew about reality. I'm telling this story now because I need to get it out, and maybe because I need someone else to know what really goes on in that place. It was October 2021, and I was driving from Los Angeles to Denver for a client meeting. I'd decided to take the scenic route through Nevada, thinking it would be a nice change from the usual interstate monotony. I'd heard about the Clown Motel online, one of those quirky roadside attractions that people love to photograph and post on social media. The idea of staying at a motel decorated with hundreds of clown figurines seemed more amusing than frightening at the time. I pulled into Tonopah just as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The town felt empty, almost abandoned, with many of the buildings looking like they'd seen better days decades ago. The Clown Motel sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering erratically in the growing darkness. Next to it, I could see the old Tonopah Cemetery, its weathered headstones creating jagged silhouettes against the darkening sky. The motel itself looked exactly like the photos I'd seen online, a long, single-story building painted in garish colors, with clown murals covering much of the exterior. But seeing it in person, especially in the fading light, gave it a different feeling entirely. The bright colors seemed muted and somehow sinister, and the painted clown faces appeared to be watching me as I parked my car. I grabbed my overnight bag and walked toward the office, passing under a large clown head mounted above the entrance. Its eyes seemed to follow me, though I knew that was just a trick of the lighting. The lobby was exactly what you'd expect, clowns everywhere. Figurines on every surface, paintings on the walls, even clown-themed furniture. It should have been comical, but instead, it felt overwhelming, almost oppressive. The desk clerk was a thin man in his 60s with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. He looked up from a crossword puzzle as I entered, and I noticed his hands had a slight tremor. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, just for one night," I replied, trying to sound cheerful despite the strange atmosphere. He handed me a registration form and a pen. As I filled it out, I noticed him watching me intently, as if he was memorizing my face. "First time here?" he asked. "Yes, I've heard a lot about this place online." He nodded slowly. "Most people only stay once." There was something in his tone that made me look up, but he was already turning away to get my key. "Room 108, he said, sliding a physical key across the counter. "Just down the hall to the right. Ice machines at the end if you need it." I thanked him and headed to my room, the key feeling unusually heavy in my hand. The hallway was dimly lit, with more clown decorations lining the walls. The carpet was old and worn, muffling my footsteps. I passed several doors, noting that most of the parking spaces outside were empty, but I could hear muffled sounds from behind some of the doors, televisions playing, or maybe conversations. Room 108 was at the end of the hall, just before the ice machine. I slid the key into the lock and stepped inside, immediately hitting the light switch. The room was exactly what I'd expected: 2 beds, a small table, and clowns. Lots of clowns. Ceramic figurines on the dresser, a large painting of a sad clown above one of the beds, and smaller clown-themed decorations scattered throughout the room. I set my bag down and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. My room faced the cemetery, and I could see the old headstones clearly in the moonlight. Some of them dated back to the early 1900s, when Tonopah was a booming mining town. Now it was just a collection of weathered stone monuments to people long forgotten. I decided to get some ice and maybe explore the town a bit before settling in for the night. The ice machine was just outside my room, humming loudly in the quiet hallway. As I filled my ice bucket, I heard a door open somewhere behind me. I turned to look, but the hallway appeared empty. The sound of the door closing echoed softly, but I couldn't tell which room it had come from. I walked back toward the lobby, thinking I might ask the desk clerk about local restaurants, but found the office empty. A small bell sat on the counter with a sign that read "Ring for service," but I decided not to bother him. Instead, I walked outside to get a better look at the motel's exterior decorations. The night air was crisp and dry, typical for the Nevada desert in October. The motel's neon sign buzzed and flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the parking lot. I walked along the front of the building, looking at the various clown murals painted on the walls. Some were cheerful and cartoonish, others more realistic and somehow unsettling in the artificial light. As I reached the end of the building, I noticed a small side door that I hadn't seen before. It was painted the same color as the wall, making it almost invisible unless you were looking for it. There was no handle on the outside, and no sign indicating what it might lead to. I tried pushing on it gently, but it seemed to be locked or blocked from the inside. I was about to head back to my room when I heard something that made me freeze. It was laughter, soft, distant, but distinctly the sound of children laughing. It seemed to be coming from the cemetery. I looked toward the old graveyard, but saw nothing moving among the headstones. The laughter came again, closer this time, and I realized it might be coming from inside the motel. I walked back to the office, but it was still empty. The laughter had stopped, and now the only sounds were the humming of the ice machine and the distant buzz of the neon sign. I went back to my room, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I tried to watch television, but the reception was poor, with most channels showing nothing but static. I managed to find one local news station, but it was running old programming, what looked like news broadcasts from the 1990s. I assumed it was some kind of nostalgia programming and left it on for background noise. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to get ready for bed. I'd had a long day of driving and wanted to get an early start in the morning. I brushed my teeth and changed into my pajamas, all while trying to ignore the dozens of clown faces staring at me from around the room. I'd always found clowns more annoying than scary, but there was something about being surrounded by them in this isolated place that was starting to get to me. I turned off the lights and got into bed, but found it difficult to fall asleep. The room was too quiet, and every small sound seemed amplified. The old building creaked and settled, and I could hear the wind whistling around the corners of the motel. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but they seemed to fade away before I could be sure. I must have dozed off, because I was awakened by a sound that took me a moment to identify. It was music, the kind of cheerful, tinkling melody you'd hear from a child's music box or an ice cream truck. It was coming from somewhere inside the motel, and it seemed to be getting closer. I got up and went to the window, but the parking lot was empty and dark. The music continued, a simple, repetitive tune that was somehow both innocent and deeply unsettling. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to determine if it was coming from the hallway, but the sound seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Then it stopped. I waited for several minutes, but the music didn't return. I went back to bed, but now I was wide awake. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of a key turning in my door lock. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I was sure I had locked the door, and I could see the chain was still in place. But I distinctly heard the sound of a key, and then the soft click of the lock disengaging. The door didn't open, but I could hear breathing on the other side. I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The chain was still secure, and I could see that the lock was still in the locked position. But I could still hear the breathing, slow, steady, and definitely coming from just outside my room. I crept toward the door as quietly as I could and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit only by the dim overhead lights. But as I watched, a shadow moved past the door, too quick for me to see clearly. I waited, but nothing else happened. I went back to bed, but there was no way I was going to fall asleep now. I kept the phone's flashlight on and set it on the nightstand, casting a small circle of light in the otherwise dark room. The clown faces seemed to leer at me from the shadows, their painted smiles taking on a sinister quality in the dim light. Around 2 a.m, I heard the music again. This time it was definitely coming from inside the motel, and it sounded like it was right next door. I got up and put my ear to the wall, and I could hear it clearly, that same childlike melody, playing over and over again. I decided to get dressed and investigate. I put on my jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my room key, and carefully opened the door. The hallway was empty and quiet, but I could still hear the music. It seemed to be coming from room 110, right next to mine. I walked to the door and listened. The music was definitely coming from inside, but I could also hear something else, voices. They were soft and indistinct, but they sounded like children talking. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was definitely a conversation happening. I knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" The music stopped immediately. The voices stopped too, and suddenly the hallway was completely silent. I waited for a response, but none came. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Hello? I'm staying next door, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right." Still nothing. I looked down and noticed that no light was coming from under the door. The room appeared to be completely dark inside. I went back to my room, more unsettled than before. I sat on the bed and tried to think rationally about what I was experiencing. Maybe it was just the television in the next room, or maybe there was a family with children staying there and they were having trouble sleeping. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. I decided to try to get some sleep, but I left the bathroom light on and kept my phone close. I lay down on the bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed that one of the clown figurines on the dresser had moved. I sat up and looked more carefully. I was certain that when I'd arrived, there had been 3 clown figurines on the dresser, arranged in a neat row. Now there were only 2, and they were positioned differently than I remembered. I got up and looked around the room, using my phone's flashlight to check every corner. I found the missing figurine on the nightstand next to my bed, a small ceramic clown with a red nose and a wide, painted smile. I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there when I went to bed. I picked up the figurine and examined it closely. It was heavier than I'd expected, and the paint was chipped in several places, giving it a worn, aged appearance. The clown's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, though I knew that was just the way they were painted. I carried the figurine back to the dresser and set it down with the others. As I did, I noticed that all 3 clowns were now facing toward the bed, whereas before they had been facing the wall. I turned them all to face the wall and went back to bed. I lay there for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of a light sleep. Every time I started to relax, I'd hear something, a creak, a whisper, or the sound of movement in the hallway. At one point, I thought I heard children laughing again, but when I listened more carefully, it sounded more like adults trying to imitate children's laughter. Around 4 in the morning, I heard the sound of my door handle turning. I sat up immediately, my heart racing. I could see the handle moving in the dim light from the bathroom, turning slowly and deliberately. The chain was still in place, and the lock was still engaged, but someone or something was definitely trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and called out, "Who's there?" "The door is locked." The handle stopped moving and snapped back into place. I waited, but nothing else happened. I got up and looked through the peephole again, but the hallway was empty. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bag and prepared to leave, even though it was still the middle of the night. I'd rather drive tired than spend another hour in that room. But as I was gathering my things, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The 3 clown figurines on the dresser were now all facing me again, and they had been rearranged in a different pattern. They were now positioned in a triangle formation, with the largest one in the center. And sitting in the middle of the triangle was a small piece of paper that definitely hadn't been there before. I approached the dresser cautiously and picked up the paper. It was old and yellowed, and written on it in faded ink was a single sentence, "We've been waiting for you." I dropped the paper and grabbed my bag, no longer caring about being quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, expecting to find it empty as before. But this time, there was someone there. At the far end of the hallway, near the lobby, stood a figure in a clown costume. It was tall and thin, with a white face and red nose, dressed in a colorful outfit that looked old and tattered. The figure was completely motionless, just standing there watching me. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move or speak, but I could feel its eyes on me even from that distance. I started walking toward my car, keeping my back to the wall and my eyes on the clown. As I moved, the figure began to follow me, matching my pace but maintaining the same distance. I reached the lobby and looked for the desk clerk, but the office was still empty. The clown figure had stopped at the entrance to the hallway and was now just standing there, watching me through the glass doors of the lobby. I rushed outside to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. The clown figure was now standing at the lobby window, its white face pressed against the glass. I could see its painted smile clearly now, and there was something wrong with it. The paint was smeared and running, as if it had been applied while wet. I got in my car and started the engine, not bothering to warm it up. As I backed out of the parking space, I looked toward the lobby window, but the figure was gone. I drove toward the exit, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That's when I saw them in my rearview mirror. There were more clown figures now, at least a dozen of them, standing in the parking lot behind me. They were all different sizes and wore different costumes, but they all had the same white faces and painted smiles. They stood perfectly still, watching my car as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I reached Carson City, nearly 2 hours away. I pulled into the first hotel I found and booked a room for the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep, so I spent the time researching the Clown Motel online, trying to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. What I found disturbed me even more. The motel had been built in 1985, but the land it sat on had a much older history. The adjacent cemetery contained the graves of people who had died in various mining accidents and disasters throughout the early 1900s. But there were also unmarked graves, dozens of them, that contained the remains of people who had died under mysterious circumstances. I found several forum posts and blog entries from people who had stayed at the motel over the years. Many of them described experiences similar to mine: strange sounds, moving objects, and encounters with figures in clown costumes. Some claimed to have seen the ghosts of children who had died in the town's early days, dressed up as clowns to entertain visitors. But the most disturbing thing I found was a news article from 1987, just 2 years after the motel had opened. A family of 4 had been staying at the motel when they simply vanished. Their car was found in the parking lot, their belongings still in their room, but there was no trace of the family members themselves. The case was never solved, and the family was never found. There were other disappearances over the years, though not many, maybe one every few years. Always people traveling alone. Always people with no strong connections to the area. The local police seemed to treat these as people who had simply decided to start new lives elsewhere, but I wondered if there was something more sinister happening. I never did make it to Denver that day. Instead, I drove straight home to Los Angeles, calling my client to reschedule our meeting. I told them I'd had car trouble, which wasn't entirely untrue. I was too shaken to drive safely for several more hours. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about the Clown Motel. I would dream about those painted faces, about the sound of children's laughter echoing through empty hallways, and about the feeling of being watched by dozens of eyes. I considered seeing a therapist, but I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd experienced without sounding crazy. About a month later, I received something in the mail that made my blood run cold. It was a postcard featuring a photograph of the Clown Motel, with its gaudy exterior and flickering neon sign. The postcard was postmarked from Tonopah, Nevada, but there was no return address. On the back, in the same faded ink I'd seen on the note in my room, was a single sentence: "Thanks for visiting. Come back soon." I never told anyone about this experience until now. I've tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, that the stress of travel and the creepy atmosphere of the motel had played tricks on my mind. But I can't explain the physical evidence, the moved figurines, the note, the postcard. I've thought about going back, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But every time I consider it, I remember the feeling of being watched, the sound of that music box melody, and the sight of those clown figures standing in the parking lot. And I know that some places are better left alone. The Clown Motel is still operating, still taking reservations from curious travelers and horror enthusiasts. If you're thinking about staying there, I won't try to stop you. But I will tell you this: pay attention to the small details. Notice when things move. Listen for sounds that don't belong. And if you see figures in clown costumes, don't assume they're part of the show. Because some of them might be something else entirely. I still have that postcard. I keep it in my desk drawer at work, as a reminder that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or reason. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the office, I'll take it out and look at it. And I swear I can still hear that music box melody, faint but unmistakable, playing somewhere in the distance. 3 years have passed since that night in Tonopah, and I still haven't found a rational explanation for what I experienced. I've researched the town's history, the motel's past, and even the psychology of fear and suggestion. Nothing provides a satisfactory answer. But I've learned to live with the mystery. Some things don't need to be understood, they just need to be survived. And I did survive that night at the Clown Motel, even if I'm not entirely sure why I was allowed to leave. If you ever find yourself driving through Nevada late at night, and you see that flickering neon sign beckoning you to stop, Remember my story. Remember that not every roadside attraction is as harmless as it seems. And remember that sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are the ones that are hiding in plain sight, behind painted smiles and colorful costumes. The Clown Motel is still out there, still waiting for its next visitor. I just hope that when you read this, you'll make the smart choice and keep driving. Because some experiences are too high a price to pay for a night's lodging, no matter how unique or memorable they might be. And if you do decide to stay, despite everything I've told you, then I have one final piece of advice: don't trust the clowns. Any of them. Because in a place like that, you never know which ones are real and which ones are something else entirely. Author's note: this account was written in 2024, 3 years after the events described. The Clown Motel continues to operate in Tonopah, Nevada, adjacent to the old Tonopah Cemetery. While the author cannot verify the supernatural claims made in this story, the motel's reputation for unusual experiences continues to grow among travelers and paranormal enthusiasts.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.